According to the United Nations, more than 4.3 million refugees have fled Ukraine since Russia invaded. Many more, of course, internally displaced. This country has approved 30,000 applications of people hoping to come to Canada. But as the war evolves, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees fears a long, drawn-out conflict could worsen the humanitarian crisis. I spoke with High Commissioner Filippo Grandi on Friday. Here is part of our conversation. Mr. Grandi, nice to see you. Thank you for making the time for us. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
I want to start by just getting you to sort of characterize, given that you've been to Ukraine and to Poland, what you're seeing there and how it compares to other refugee crises.
The most impressive images were during my first trip. I went really a few days after the beginning of the war. I'm talking about the refugee flow now. It was like an ocean of people, a river of people moving out of Ukraine into neighboring countries. I must say the most heartbreaking scenes were the separations between men and their families, because men were staying behind to fight. And I had never seen anything like this, and it was very, very moving, but also really heartbreaking. And the situation has changed on the refugee side. The flow has slowed down a bit. There's a lot of displacement inside Ukraine, and I think people are now waiting to see what happens next in this very, very unpredictable war.
Well, I was going to ask about that. Certainly there are millions of people who have left the country, but millions also internally displaced. It does seem as though Ukrainians are now thinking about whether they should return to perhaps Western Ukraine, to places that might be safer. Are you seeing some of that?
Yeah, a little bit of that already, but I think that the greater feeling is one of let's really wait and see what happens next, because the war is still raging in the eastern part of the country, and it's, as we have seen over and over again, is extremely violent, so people are understandably very anxious. But in the west of Ukraine, there's a great concentration of displaced people, but they are also in other parts of the country, and actually our current effort is really trying to reach them wherever they are so that they don't all congregate in one part of the country.
And how difficult is that?
It is difficult where conflict is active, where there is insecurity, because we simply cannot have access. It is difficult in particular in those hard to reach, besieged, bombed, isolated cities like Mariupol. We've been trying all along, the Red Cross, the United Nations, but it has been very, very hard to get through.
You tweeted just a few days ago about people dying in a Mediterranean refugee tragedy. 90 people died then. And you said in that tweet that Europe has proven its ability to host refugees from Ukraine generously and effectively. It must now urgently consider how to apply this to other refugee and migrants knocking. Why is there this discrepancy between how people are being treated?
Well, it's a big issue. But the point I wanted to make in that tweet is that, some politicians in Europe in particular have given us such a hard time for years, saying it's impossible. We can't deal with these flows. Push them back, build walls, don't allow boats to dock in our ports. And this was about a few hundreds here, a few thousands there. Now Europe has been able to absorb 4.3 million in the space of a few weeks. So it is possible. That's the point. This is what Angela Merkel said in 2015. Wir schaffen das. We can do it. So she's now proven right, 7 years later. And I think that there are lessons here to be learned for other refugees of other origins that will continue to go to Europe as a safe place. And I know it's complex, it's difficult, it's not from neighboring countries. Maybe the relationship between flight and war is not so evident, but that's the point I'm trying to make. Many of the people who come to Europe also flee from war, from bombs, from terror, from discrimination, from persecution. So I hope that now that correlation will be more explainable to public opinion.
You think about the Syrian refugee crisis and the Afghan refugee crisis, and I'll ask you more about your trip there recently. But I mean, the one thing, of course, that stands out is that we're dealing with people of color. And I wonder if you think that there is some sort of systemic racism or discriminatory view of those refugees, or whether certain countries prioritize refugees based on the color of their skin.
Certainly there are politicians that do that. I've heard politicians, even in my own country, say, these are the real refugees, not the others. And that's a scandal. That's profoundly racist and discriminatory. And this has a bad influence on public opinion. But I think that there is a lot of solidarity also for everybody else. But we need to develop Europe in particular, but not just Europe. North America, Australia, the rich world needs to develop systems to manage these flows that are not discriminatory and that give an equal chance to everybody to present their case as asylum seekers, if that's a legitimate claim.
While global attention remains focused on the war in Ukraine, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees is urging people not to forget about Afghanistan. Filippo Grandi visited that country in March. Tens of thousands of people fled Afghanistan after U.S. forces withdrew last August. The Taliban then took control of the country. I spoke to the High Commissioner about the humanitarian situation inside Afghanistan on Friday. Here is part 2 of our conversation. So let me talk about Afghanistan. You were there last month. Give us a sense of what it is like on the ground now for Afghans.
Well, the Taliban are in control, and for the foreseeable future, they will be in control. So the international community must find a way to interact, to engage with the Taliban. The Taliban have recently made a very bad decision, which is not to allow girls in high school education. But the response to that must be continuous engagement. I was there twice since the Taliban have taken over. I've had discussions with them. It is possible to discuss all the complex issues, rights of women, minorities, education for all. It's not simple. We will need a lot of patience and a lot of time, but I think it is worth engaging. We can't let Afghanistan go, because if Afghanistan collapses as a state, as public services, as the economy, then we will have another colossal humanitarian emergency on our hands.
When I was speaking with our immigration minister, Sean Fraser, who I know you met with this week, he said that one of the major differences in the response between Ukraine and Afghanistan is the ability to get people out. It is still very hard to get people out of Afghanistan. How do you address that? You said you've talked to the Taliban, but how can the UNHCR facilitate that?
If I may express a view that may not be so popular. Sure. Certainly there are people that are at risk, and it is important to try and find safe ways for them to exit the country. But the priority is really to help the Afghans who are in the country, who will stay in the country and who will never leave. That's the priority. Actually, the priority is to prevent an outflow of people, because that would be not manageable. I'm not talking about 1, 2, 10 individual cases. I'm talking about the population. The neighboring countries, Iran, Pakistan, already host millions of Afghans from decades before. So those people, those countries and those people need help. Some of them need resettlement to places like Canada. But I think the priority today is to find a way to assist people inside, including talking to the Taliban about human rights, about protecting women, about protecting minorities.
I know you have lots of glowing words for Canada, and I'm sure the government was happy to hear them. But is there anything else Canada could be doing as a country that has led with lots of refugee resettlement programs in its history?
I find it fascinating that the media here are always asking me what Canada can do more. I'm very happy with what Canada does. And I'm not just talking about the government, I'm talking about the people. There is an incredible sense of solidarity here for people in distress, people in need. Certainly, any country, any rich country like Canada can do more helping refugees where they are, can do more in resettlement. But you said I've used glowing words. I will continue to use glowing words because I think that, for example, if I may, resettlement, taking refugees from one country to another, like Canada. Canada has always been a big resettlement country. But in the last few years, when resettlement really suffered a lot from cuts in the United States program, it was Canada that saved resettlement as a solution for many vulnerable refugees. Now the US is back with a big program, which is great, but if it hadn't been for Canada staying the course on resettlement, increasing it over the last few years, we would have maybe lost the capacity to do this for many vulnerable people, and that deserves glowing words.
You talked about taking care of Afghans inside their country. And I imagine in all countries where there are situations of conflict and internal struggle, your primary goal would be to prevent a refugee crisis. And how are we doing as a world in doing that, I guess would be my question.
It's interesting because yesterday I had this discussion with the Minister of International Development, with
Harjit Sajjan,
and he is very keen to invest in prevention, and I fully agree with that approach. Displacement is an interesting symptom. It's a result of conflict, but sometimes it may also be a symptom that conflict is coming or that the situation is unstable. So addressing situations of displacement, solving them, has also a powerful preventive effect, and therefore we will work together in that respect. It is possible to do it, and I'm also very keen, the number of people displaced, refugees, internally displaced, is well over 90 million by now, especially with 10-11 million Ukrainians displaced. We need to look at some of those situations and see how we can reduce it. People that are not displaced or for whom a solution is found are less liable to be a factor in a future conflict.
Just last question to go back to Ukraine where we started. How worried are you about the longer this goes on for the Ukrainian people, the people that are staying there and the people who want to go back?
I'm very worried. And as a matter of fact, we speak a lot, and rightly so, about the displaced, about the refugees. Actually, the people most at risk are those that cannot even become displaced because they're trapped in those cities under awful bombing and violence. I'm worried because military analysts seem to indicate that the most likely scenario is a protracted war. Maybe slightly lower intensity, but not resolved in any foreseeable future. In our experience as a humanitarian agency, these are the wars that are the most difficult to deal with in terms of humanitarian consequences. And very often, after a while, they get forgotten in public opinion and in the media. And then mobilizing resources to address the consequences becomes even more difficult. It's not the case yet, and I do hope that a miracle will happen and the political solution will be found, because otherwise we will live with humanitarian disaster for many years to come.
Hi, Commissioner. Thank you for making the time. Good to see you here in Canada. I appreciate it.
Thank you.